Welcome back to Film Recaps. Today I will show you an action, science fiction, romantic film from 2016 titled Passengers. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The opening scene of the movie shows a spaceship, the starship Avalon, traveling through space to reach its destination, the colony world of Homestead 2. The Starship Avalon is a high-tech spaceship that is operating automatically to transport 5,000 passengers and 258 crew members who are hibernating in their pods. On the way, the spaceship moves into an asteroid field that slightly damages it. Although the ship innately troubleshoots all its damages, one of the hibernation pods breaks down, which wakens a passenger, Jim Preston. A hologram welcomes Jim, who is a 20-year-old mechanical engineer, and informs him that he has been hibernating for 120 years. The hologram instructs Jim to use his ID band to use facilities on the spaceship and then guides him to his cabin. After taking some rest, Jim eagerly comes to attend his first lesson and realizes that he has awoken 90 years earlier from the specified time. Jim hurriedly approaches a virtual assistant and sends a video message to the customer helpline, noting that he has awoken 90 years early due to some malfunctioning in his hibernation pod and doesn't know how to repair it. The system displays that his message will be delivered within 19 years and that he might get a response within 55 years, much to Jim's dismay. After leaving the control room, he spots Arthur, an android, who works as a bartender on the ship. Jim asks Arthur for his help to repair the pod, but Arthur mentions that hibernation pods are a failsafe and can't malfunction. The next day, Jim wakes up and moves to the mess to have breakfast. Then, he moves to the workshop, where he finds a manual and all necessary tools to repair his hibernation pod. He repairs the pod by following the instructions from the manual but does not know how to go back into hibernation. Afterward, he moves to the crew pod room and tries to open it but doesn't succeed as it requires authorized access. Disappointed, Jim approaches Arthur, who suggests he enjoy his alone time on the Avalon. In the scenes, we see a montage of Jim entertaining himself with all the services at hand. However, with the passage of time, he gets bored of all the luxuries. While roaming around, Jim finds high-tech spacesuits and decides to go for a spacewalk while safely tethered to the ship. When Jim returns to the ship, he contemplates suicide by opening the airlock without a spacesuit, but stops himself and runs into the pod area. As Jim gets up, he observes a beautiful woman, Aurora Lane, lying inside a hibernation pod. Allured by her beauty, Jim goes to the archive room to find out more information about Aurora, who is a writer and lived in New York City. As time goes on, Jim gets obsessed with her and shares his feelings with Arthur. Afterward, Jim gets an idea to wake her up by using the manual and quickly goes to Arthur to seek his advice. However, they mutually decide that Jim should not wake Aurora up from hibernation as she will be doomed to die on the ship. Despite his efforts to dismiss his idea, he wakes her up and then runs away to hide. Afterward, he encounters Aurora and informs her they have awoken 90 years earlier. He tells her that hibernation pods don't have the ability to make people hibernate. However, Aurora does not want to give up hope. While Aurora goes to her cabin for some rest, Jim approaches Arthur and tells him about Aurora, who thinks that her pod malfunctioned due to an accident. He feels guilty for his actions and makes Arthur promise he will not tell Aurora anything, noting that he will tell her himself. The next morning, Aurora wakes up and tries to find a way to operate the pod, but in vain. Meanwhile, Jim approaches her, and they both move to have breakfast. As they leave, the machine breaks down. While in the control room, the system displays a list of damaged machines on the Avalon, suggesting that the spaceship is malfunctioning. After having breakfast, she starts looking for a solution to fix the pod but finds nothing helpful. Meanwhile, Aurora starts writing a story about her voyage in the Avalon. In her story, she acknowledges that Jim has given up, but she is afraid of spending her life traveling to an unreachable destination. The next day, Aurora approaches Jim, who is repairing a robot, and starts interviewing him. After roaming around, they go to a cafe where Aurora tells Jim about her life on Earth, noting that she had joined the passengers because she wants to write a story about life in the colony world. Saddened, she acknowledges that now she will never be able to write her story. To cheer her up, Jim takes Aurora to the arcade room to play games. They dance, play basketball, and watch movies. Then, Jim introduces Aurora to Arthur. Afterward, Jim starts showing his interest in Aurora and uses his upgraded robot to send her a date invitation, which she accepts. At night, Jim comes to Aurora's cabin to pick her up for their date. He takes her to the bar and then to a fancy restaurant. After having dinner, Aurora tells Jim about her father, a famous writer, who loved writing about his life experiences. As they leave the restaurant, Jim takes her spacewalking. They both madly fall in love with each other and happily start their new life together on the Avalon. The next year, on Aurora's birthday, they watch the star Arcturus while the Avalon passes by it. Then, they move to see Arthur after having dinner. Meanwhile, Aurora mentions to Arthur that Jim and she do not have any secrets, making Arthur think that Jim had told her about waking her up on purpose. While Arthur and Aurora are talking, Jim gets aside and looks over a ring that he chose to give Aurora to propose to her. In the meantime, Arthur tells Aurora how Jim had awakened her up from her hibernation pod. Devastated, Aurora rushes out of the bar and moves to her cabin. The next morning, Jim tries to approach her, but she runs away. One night, enraged, Aurora comes to Jim's room and attacks him while he is asleep. At night, there is a power outage. Although the system reboots itself in no time, it seems to have minor glitches. Back in the control room, the system seems to malfunction and shuts down eventually. Considering Jim as her culprit, Aurora is still angry with him. While watching her friend's videos, she becomes disheartened and moves to her hibernation pod. On her way, she spots Jim working in the lobby, Grand Concourse. In the morning, Aurora finds a beautiful tree planted in the lobby, much to her amusement. Later, as Jim moves through the elevator, it stops working. While in the mess, the vendor machine starts malfunctioning as Aurora orders her breakfast. Meanwhile, they hear an announcement by the deck chief, Gus Mancuso, and run to the lobby. They make Gus aware of their status. Gus takes them to the crew pod room and checks the control panel. He surmises that the system is facing a breakdown and decides to check it manually. Meanwhile, Gus trembles because of post-hibernation sickness. Later, as they step out of the elevator, a robot crashes down, much to Gus's shock. On seeing that, Jim and Aurora reveal their personal experiences of how they have faced the malfunctioning of different machines. Distressed, Gus instructs them to scan different decks of the spaceship while he goes to check their pods. While examining the pods, Gus predicts that Jim's pod malfunctioned due to a burnt clock chip while his own pod crashed down because of multiple failures at the same time, making him feel sick. In the meantime, Gus concludes that Jim had opened Aurora's pod on purpose. In the control room, Aurora confronts Gus for not punishing Jim for his unethical act. Gus tells Aurora that he does not have the authority to do anything to Jim for this and then tries to convince her to forgive him. Meanwhile, Gus feels unwell and heads towards his cabin to get some rest. As everyone goes back to their cabin, the system again malfunctions, causing gravity loss that traps Aurora in a pool of water while she is swimming. Luckily, the system reboots, which allows her to come out of water. Moreover, the gravity loss also throws Jim downwards while he is asleep. After getting his consciousness back, he hurriedly runs to Aurora, who is heading towards Gus's room. Unaware of the situation, Gus wakes up as they call out his name. Gus surmises that the system is unable to automatically repair the damage caused by the accident. After analyzing the data, Gus realizes that if the system keeps malfunctioning at this pace, the whole spaceship will be wrecked within a few years. Gus, along with Jim and Aurora, then move to the main engineering to fix the issue, but Gus collapses. Jim and Aurora take him to the infirmary where he has been diagnosed with various diseases. Using his ID band, the virtual robot tells Gus that he has very little time left to live. Later, the Avalon undergoes a critical malfunctioning which begins to destroy the spaceship. Jim and Aurora approach Gus, who is dying. Gus gives them his ID band to access unauthorized entries. After Gus's death, they decide to go back to the main engineering room to troubleshoot the problem. Moments later, Gus dies in front of them. On their way, they find Arthur hurting himself because of glitches. Jim quickly approaches him and removes his batteries. Then, along with Aurora, he enters the main engineering room, where they find a damaged chamber. By using Gus's ID band, they open it and discover big holes there caused by an asteroid, causing the pressure to pull them inside. Jim manages to destroy the remote that stabilizes the chamber's pressure. Moving on, they find a reactor in which a meteorite is stuck due to the crash. Jim attempts to restore the computer by replacing its parts, but it doesn't work. As Jim tries to manually vent it, the system shows that its outer door is jammed. Jim instructs Aurora to vent the meteorite as he opens the door manually with his hands. Aurora tries to stop him from going outside, but Jim seems determined. He gives her Gus's ID band and then puts on the spacesuit to move out of the spaceship. Due to malfunctioning, the spaceship's temperature rises, and the machines inside begin to crash. As Aurora attempts to pull the lever, she gets hurt. On the other hand, Jim arrives at the door of the vent tube and tries to open it. Meanwhile, he realizes that the door is stuck, and he must keep holding it during the vent. Aurora urges Jim to come back, but he instructs her to proceed to save the 5,000 other passengers. Downhearted, Aurora pulls the lever to vent the meteorite while Jim keeps the door open. With the successful elimination of the meteorite, the temperature of the spaceship declines. During the vent, Jim's tether breaks and is pushed out into space. Jim's spacesuit gets damaged, making him float helplessly in space. As Jim is at death's door, he apologizes to Aurora for his selfishness. Aurora tells Jim to hold on and rushes out to help him. She captures his broken tether and brings him to the spaceship. Saddened, Aurora drags the unconscious Jim to the infirmary and uses Gus's ID band to treat him. As things get back to normal, Jim figures out that Autodoc can hibernate a person in its pod. He offers it to Aurora to use, but Aurora chooses to spend her life on the Avalon with him. Meanwhile, they float away Gus's corpse into space with honor. Afterward, Jim proposes to Aurora and they start living a happy life. After a time lapse of 88 years, the crew members wake up from hibernation. Much to their amazement, the Grand Concourse has been changed into a magnificent grassland. Meanwhile, Aurora's voice narrates the story about their beautiful life in the Avalon, suggesting that Aurora has successfully completed the story that she always longed for. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.